Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the War for BADAB. And I know what you're all waiting for. The arrival of your favorite space fishies. And they will be popping by in this very video. But before we get to the fun stuff, we have some administrative work to oversee, as we are now finished with the first out of the 2 War for BADAB books, which means it's time to have a look at the situation at hand and the actions of certain key players. As we are all fully aware of by now, the once mighty tyrant of BADAB has seen his empire shrink quite substantially. First, a third of his little empire was cut off from him with the fall of the Zagan naval yards and the Sorengrad fortress world, isolating him from the Mantis warriors in the Endymion cluster. Then, the Minotaurs finally managed to pin down the Lamenters and take them out of the war as well, slicing off another third of the tyrant's domain, leaving Luft-Huron with nothing more than the BADAB system itself. Heavily fortified though it may be, it is nevertheless a far cry from the vast and expansive territories he once held sway over. But despite the clearly turning tide of the war, everything wasn't rosy on the Loyalist side either. They were winning, yes, but the largest challenge of all, the assault upon the BADAB system, was still ahead of them, and they were running out of space marines with which to take it. Furthermore, the Red Scorpions chapter master Verant Ortis had come into the war with a carte blanche authority to execute it in whatever way he saw fit. But after the betrayal and grief and the death of Verant Ortis, and his replacement by Caleb Cullen, the political power of the Red Scorpions had waned considerably. A period of lacking progress in the war, alongside an ever-strengthening position for his chief competition, the legate Inquisitor John Dice Frayne, had seen several chapters sympathetic to the Red Scorpions be retired from the war and replaced with those more pliant towards the Inquisition's own aims and ends. The Sons of Medusa was already securely in the Inquisition's pocket after having been given permission to loot the Signax system of its various technological treasures. Incidentally, the Minotaurs, another Inquisitorial Alliance chapter, had also had their salvage rights over the Lamenter's fleet and war gear ratified by the Legate's office as well. You know, Huron could learn a lesson or two from this. It pays to have friends in the Inquisition. And now, with yet another mysterious chapter on the way to reinforce the Loyalists, Caleb Cullen was swiftly becoming a figurehead in his own army. The Angstrom incident was a way to mark his position still, but well, that ended with Frayne once more being called upon to placate the angry Magos of Angstrom. But as Frayne's position improved, his responsibilities also grew with the advancement of the war. He had, after all, been sent here to determine the guilt and the association of the Warder's chapter with Luft-Huron's treachery, and his clear and blatant violation of the treaties of the Codex Astartes, having sent his own astral claws well and truly beyond the 1,000 Battle Brothers limit. And now, with the Mantis warriors and Lamenters suitably restrained, it was time for a little bit of investigation. The Green Sons of the Khan provided the greatest problem for the simple reason that they were still resisting. They were not prisoners to be interrogated and tested at will. Nevertheless, Figuring he had nothing to lose, Freyne dispatched an inquisitorial envoy into the Endymion cluster under a flag of de facto truce, sending out an open broadcast on all systems as to their identity, their authority, and their intended purpose. The Mantis warriors, however, refused to take the envoys to their hidden base of operation, because it's hidden. And for some strange reason, the Mantis warriors didn't trust the inquisitorial envoys to keep that secret particularly well. They did, however, present them with a small sampling of the Mantis warriors' gene seed to test for variables and mutations. Bearing in mind, the Mantis warriors had never actually seized their own regular tribute of aforementioned gene seed to the Mechanicus, unlike the Astral Claws, the legate did not expect to find anything overly worrying here, nor did he. Additionally, the Mantis warriors had behaved with relative chivalry, even quite recently, deciding to capture a crew of fire angels instead of leaving them to the tender mercies of the greenskins. Now, granted, the Mantis warriors were the ones who had disabled the Fire Angels' engines and left them stranded in the path of 2 Orc kill cruisers to begin with, but hey, minor insignificant details. And indeed, the gene seed came back as clean as can be expected. The usual minute variables of gene seed degradation and mutation, which is near inescapable in Astartes' gene seed over time, but nothing particularly alarming. As for the Lamenters, well, they were all kept aboard a prison hulk orbiting Sagan, so testing their gene seed was simplicity itself. Elementor's gene seed stock had been captured, along with their flagship, the Mater Lacriarum. Additionally, a quick little jab into the neck region and fresh samples could be collected from any Elementor currently a prisoner, guest, of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition. Interpreting the results, however, turned out to be a wee bit more complicated, for the simple fact that there were no results. Oh, samples were taken, absolutely, and they were sent to analysis, but nothing ever came back except a nicely written yet stern letter informing the Imperial Triumvirate, with Legate Inquisitor Freyne, of course, at the head of said Triumvirate, that the Lamenters were not in any way corrupted or compromised in that way. But no further data is forthcoming. And no matter how many times you ask, or how many times you flash your inquisitorial seal, that response remains the same. This is well above your clearance, son. And believe you me, it is quite rare for an Imperial Inquisitor to be told that he doesn't have the right security clearance. But hey, at least that means the Lamenters are checked out of the case as well, right? The Mantis warriors are as clean as they can be, the Lamenters are as well. The Astral Claws are already condemned, leaving only one secessionist chapter. Oh, technically not even a secessionist chapter, merely an allied chapter, the Executioners. I'm sure Freyne would have expected this to be the toughest of all the nuts to crack, considering the level of viciousness and brutality they had demonstrated in the war so far, to the point that even the Minotaurs were starting to get a little bit wary around them. But no, the inquisitorial envoys, dispatched to their twin homeworld of Stygia Aquilon, were welcomed. Executioners didn't try to resist, didn't try to hide anything. They offered the envoys every courtesy and allowed them full access to their gene seed vaults, their records, their personnel. They even gave them a full list of the Battle Brothers that had departed alongside their chief executioner. Nothing was to be withheld because, well, they had been instructed by that very self-same chief executioner to not hide anything from the Inquisition. They were still loyal servants, after all. They were merely compelled to take part in the war due to bonds of ancient loyalty. Seemingly, they were clear as well then. One almost has to ask what the greater tragedy would be if it turned out that the Mantis Warriors, Lamenters, and Executioners all were batshit crazy, secessionist, traitor heretics right alongside the Astral Claws. Then this would have been a clean war, a just war, against a truly perfidious and evil foe. Instead, it appears that 3 out of the 4 chapters were actually loyalists that had simply been misled or compelled to take the side of the Astral Claws through bonds of kinship, loyalty, and duty. When you then add on the Maelstrom squadrons, which had shown no sign of mutation or corrupt practices, nor had the Tyrants' Legion, mind you, either, well, the inescapable conclusion becomes that for the last 6 years, the Imperium had pretty much just been killing itself. A tragedy, unfortunately, quite common in the Imperium of Man, though one particular incident bears closer examination, if for no other reason than to further exemplify the human cost of this conflict. Not merely in the expenditure of lives or materiel, but in morale, in loyalty and faith in the Imperial cause, and the steps that must sometimes be taken to reinforce such loyalties. And in a galaxy all too rife with fucked up fates and short ends of the stick, the tale of Galen is hardly a uniquely heartbreaking one. But in a battle with near nothing but losers, the poor unfortunate populace of Galen is just about as damn near the bottom of the barrel as we've got. Near perfectly exemplified by the fact that there used to be 2 inhabited planets in the Galen system, Galen 2 and 4, with 2 having been by far the most prosperous and populous one. It was a hard-scrabble world, downright toxic, in fact, requiring vast environmental domes to be constructed to allow people to even live on the planet. But its considerable mineral wealth and easily exploitable riches still made it a relatively nice home for the population, and an important strategic target for loyalists and secessionists alike, who had traded the world from one hand to the other nearly half a dozen times, until a final encounter between the Firehawks chapter, hardly the most silken-handed of Astartes formations at the best of times, and a mixed secessionist strike force finally blew out the life-supporting domes, rendering a barely inhabitable planet completely uninhabitable. And for the poor sad sods unfortunate enough to not lose their lives in the catastrophic collapse of their life-supporting domes, and even a harsher reality awaited them as they were gathered and shipped to Galen 4, a smaller, poorer world that was hard-pressed to support its own disheveled population, never mind another few million refugees. Unsurprisingly, the local government was swiftly overwhelmed by the increased demand upon everything from food to clean water to shelter, etc., etc., etc. All the myriad things people need to not just stay safe, but to just survive. And then, as a final little fly in the ointment, an Ordo Hereticus investigatory team arrived on Galen 4 to see if there were any wrong thinkers still around in the population, to root out those who may have cooperated with the secessionist regime when they were still in control of the planet and the wider sector. Ah yes, a calming influence on the disgruntled, hungry, angry, thirsty masses. A witch hunt. Sometimes I think the Inquisition does this shit on purpose. The Ordo Hereticus detachment, along with its leading inquisitor, investigatory team, and security guards, were of course thoroughly loathed by the local populace. In fact, the only thing that could outweigh their shared dislike for them would be their fear for them. Hatred and fear. Potent combination. But the Ordo Hereticus team were not complete amateurs to this either. They knew that they would not be the most popular girls on the block, and so instead prepared a stick with which to control the citizenry. Most of the people on Galen 4 lived in the so-called capital of the world. I would like to add some hefty quotation marks on that word as well, since the capital, the old city as it was called, was essentially a vast manufactorum complex, or, more precisely, what was left of one after it had been abandoned for just about a century or so. This wasn't Galen's first war, you see, nor is it likely to be its last, but the previous one was particularly bad, as it was the scene of a major chaos uprising. The heretics were eventually defeated, but the Imperium reacts harshly to such things, and Galen 4, which had been a flagging industrial world for quite some time now due to a lack of raw resources, was killed via administrative means. The usual shipments that would arrive and put the manufactorum complexes to work became fewer and fewer and fewer, until eventually they simply just stopped coming altogether. And without the trade and income from these frequent shipments, Galen 4 was left to fend for itself. And since the world had been exploited over the course of previous centuries, there wasn't a whole lot left to rely on. A vicious spiral of poverty. Nevertheless, the local rulers had done wonders with what they had at their disposal, and had managed to create a relatively stable, if small, society. The influx of aforementioned millions of refugees, however, put an end to that tranquil state of affairs rather quickly. And then the boot arrived as well, in the form of the Ordo Hereticus. They swiftly then occupied the old city's single remaining working water treatment plant, ensuring that the populace's access to clean drinking water was controlled solely by the Inquisition. And there you have the boot. Unfortunately, Inquisitor Shard, a woman of considerable experience with dealing with such situations, had underestimated the resilience of her marks this time around. The governance of Galen 4 had worked alongside the secessionists, that much is true, just like they'd worked alongside the Loyalists, and the secessionists before that, and the Loyalists before that, and the secessionists before that, and so on. And they had done so not through any real sense of deep-rooted loyalty, but out of plain and simple necessity. The surest and swiftest way to assure that the tyrant of the week did not further ravage the poor planet of Galen 4 was just to do whatever they told you to do. Nothing more to it, really. But this line of reasoning was unlikely to be considered overly persuasive by Inquisitor Shard, and so the ruling class found themselves in a little bit of a bind. On the one hand, the Inquisition had control over their water treatment plant. If they didn't have that, they could turn off the tap at any moment and allow thousands to starve to death. Well, thousands more, that is. The Inquisition's intervention had already severely disrupted the overstrained logistical network of Galen 4, and thousands were already dropping dead in the streets, with violent gangs turning upon one another to fight over what little food and water was readily available. Further, If the government simply just sat on its hands, sooner or later Shard would get around to the evidence against them. Even on a world like Galen 4, there were plentiful, ambitious individuals who might see this as an excellent opportunity to rise through the ranks by placing their superiors in a very small and exceedingly uncomfortable inquisitorial cell. But whinging about reality is easy. The question, what could be done, was a far more complicated one. Galen 4 was a small and poor world. It didn't have a PDF or a real standing army of any sort. It's not like they could stand up to the Imperium, right? Unless, of course, you don't have any other options. This is always the problem with leaving people with no way out, isn't it? No matter how impossible the solution might seem, if it's the only one. And the Inquisition hadn't brought all that many men either. A single regiment of Imperial Guardsmen, not a good one either. An indentured regiment, penal legion, forced soldiery, and a small detachment of inquisitorial stormtroopers. Now, they were intimidating to be sure, but there's only a handful or two of them. And Galen did have a police force. One that had expanded quite rapidly alongside the influx of refugees to control the violence and the crime. Alright then. Alia Ecta Est. And for once, Galen 4 found itself on the side of fortune. An uprising had been planned and kept successfully secret from the inquisitorial agents. It was to start with a large-scale populist rebellion, first and foremost in the various refugee camps. This would draw the Inquisition's attention away from any actions of the local government, who would seem to be doing everything in their power to quell the unrest, just as they had done on several previous occasions. They would request aid from the indentured Imperial Guard Regiment, who had already been asked to do this multiple times now, and they would, in all due likelihood, receive it. After all, it was Inquisitor Shard's pretty little arse on the line as much as anyone else's if the refugee camps exploded into full-scale, uncontrolled violence. And of course, to ensure that the reaction was sufficiently forceful as to deter any further uprising, the city warders would be armed and mobilized on scale alongside with the armed members of the industrial guilds. They loaded up in their trucks, the handful of armored vehicles they possessed, and set out into the streets out from their city warders' barracks and guild houses, and headed not towards the refugee camps. All of them were heading straight for the water treatment facilities, and it took quite some while before the inquisitorial personnel noticed what was happening. And when it occurred, they assumed that they were heading there to protect them, that something had changed, that the outburst of violence had changed direction like a wildfire, and begun to flow in their direction. The stormtroopers were put on high guard, of course, but when the columns of city warders arrived, they opened the doors, because they were the reinforcements, right? I mean, it's not quite up to the snuff of the Horus Heresy, I agree, but nevertheless, nice move. And from there, we all know more or less how this particular song and dance tends to work out, don't we? The inquisitorial stormtroopers on guard on the outer perimeter were murdered instantly as the city warders turned their projectile weapons upon them. By the time the betrayal was even known to the rest of the command staff inside of the water treatment plant, the city warders were already past the checkpoints, heading deeper inside of the complex. The guards outside were either dead or pinned down by superior enemy numbers with the advantage of surprise. The indentured Imperial Guard Regiment was halfway to the refugee camps. And by the time they received word of the coup at the water treatment plant, I once again stress the nature of this Imperial Guard regiment. These people were being forced to fight. What do you think their reaction was when the word came down the grapevine that their superior officers had either been captured, killed, or were missing, and they were now in a supposedly hostile city surrounded by quote-unquote their enemies? Well, I imagine a considerable quantity of these indentured guardsmen swiftly found themselves a lot of brand new friends, who they could vociferously inform that, yeah, no, they never really liked the Inquisition to begin with. And hey, they might even be speaking the truth. Kind of difficult to really blame the indentured slave soldiers for their lack of loyalty, to be entirely honest with you. And within hours, the coup was done. And in all reasonable metrics, it had been a resounding success, frankly. The Imperial garrison, along with the stormtroopers, had either been overwhelmed or scattered across the old city, or simply been recruited by the rebels. They had even succeeded in killing Inquisitor Shard early on in the uprising. A close-quarters bomb blast had left her ruptured, shredded corpse nearly unrecognizable. But the seal of office and her regalia spoke as to her identity. The rebels simply just left the corpse where it fell. No need to further desecrate the dead. These were merely rebels, after all, not Chaos heretical scum. All they wanted was for Galen 4 to be just, please, left alone. The war had done enough damage as it was, and whilst the sacrifice of these loyal Imperial citizens was unfortunate, the planet had simply just had enough and wanted to go at it alone, and hoped and prayed that the wider war would keep the Loyalists too busy to return to finish the job. And with the secessionists contained within their final system, they were unlikely to come knocking anytime soon either. It was a foolish hope, honestly, and basically an impossible one. Legate Inquisitor John Dice Frayne, of course, had a reputation to maintain. And you don't just go around killing inquisitorial personnel without retribution. Significant retribution as well. And so he immediately declared, upon hearing the news, that the Galen system had gone rogue. Worse, it had become an apostate system. It had been liberated by the loyal forces of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition and his servants in the Imperial Guard and the Adeptus Astartes. And despite this, the ungrateful populace had risen in a most repugnant and heretical revolt against their rightful masters. You may remember we spoke about the occasional world that was made an example out of previously? Well, this is one of those examples, as the Legate Inquisitor bent Carab Cullen's ear, requesting an immediate and swift response to this most heinous of crimes. And specifically, he requested the dispatch of the Sons of Medusa. As the Legate Inquisitor was entirely confident that this chapter in particular would approach this problem with the necessary degree of severity to ensure that nobody else would get the silly notion of assassinating an Inquisitor. Carab Cullen, however, coming famously from a very uncooperative chapter, had not yet grown quite so fond of the Inquisition's way of making their examples, and so added in a little bit of a caveat. He would authorize the deployment of the Sons of Medusa, usually far more than any small rebellious system would warrant, but he requested a couple caveats. The planet was to remain habitable. No exterminators nonsense, Mr. Inquisitor. No itchy trigger fingers for the Sons of Medusa either. No testing out some of that unknown tech you undoubtedly found on Signax. Furthermore, the planet's infrastructure and logistical systems were also to remain intact, including the water treatment plant and other food-producing necessities, and a significant portion of the planet's population was also to be allowed to live. Freyne was not overly happy about the fact that his commander was bucking him once more, but these were conditions that he could live with, provided that an Ordo Hereticus detachment under another Inquisitor, Cramner this time, would accompany the Sons of Medusa, and would also have carte blanche authority to prosecute the ringleaders of the rebellion, and presumably also define what a ringleader is. And so long as this ringleader definition did not grow so wide as to encompass the majority of the population, this was something that Carib Cullen could live with. And as for the Sons of Medusa, well, second Christmas. Granted, Galen IV had not been a fully operational manufactorum world for a very long time, yet, nevertheless, it once had been a major manufacturing complex, and who knew what manner of lovely treasures might be lying around in the dirt, protected only by a handful of ratty-ass civilians who for some reason or another had decided to pick up guns. The Sons were a little bit, fuzzy on that particular portion, but they had absolutely gotten the message that they were allowed to shoot them, so long as they kept the shooting to a relative minimum anywho. And so their Iron Thane, Valand Cal, organized 3 full companies to retake the planet. 3 full goddamn companies. To assault a world that didn't even have a PDF. In fact, the closest they had was a police force. Like shooting a gnat with an elephant gun. And speaking of overkill, when the Sons of Medusa arrived in orbit above Galen IV, they immediately demonstrated that they had a very creative interpretation of their orders to keep as much of the planet intact as possible, by initiating a large-scale orbital bombardment all around the old city. When the 3 companies of Sons of Medusa then landed straight into the craters that they had so recently blasted into the planet, they swept aside any resistance. The word is pointless in this context. It's a bunch of shell-shocked civilians, some of which may have been armed, being engaged by space marines after a planetary bombardment. And then they started doing what their kind do best: building. Rather than launching an immediate lightning strike into the depths of the city, the Sons of Medusa elected instead to surround the old city with fortifications, with automated gun turrets, with artillery pits, batteries, SAM sites, and everything else you would expect if they had been encircling Vrax itself. And I suspect this was more so to stave off boredom than anything else. Upon arriving in system, it would have been immediately clear to the ships in orbit that Galen IV was not in any state to offer organized resistance. Whilst the rebellion itself had been a remarkable success, the various parties that had launched it, the city warders, the industrial guilds, the various leaders of governments, refugees, etc., swiftly fell out with one another when it came time to begin dividing the spoils. The leaders in the refugee camps were not happy with their water rations and so complained violently. The city warders were not happy since they had been doing most of the fighting. Why were they not seeing the returns? And so they started slicing out their own little territorial pieces. The industrial guilds, hoping to return to a period of former glory, were equally unsatisfied and set up their own little fiefdom. And outside of their predetermined territories, the old city was in a state of near complete lawlessness, with roaming gangs of bandits wandering the streets, killing, murdering, and stealing anything and everything they so fancied. A direct landing straight into the heart of the old city would probably have ended all real resistance within a couple of hours. But the Sons of Medusa had other objectives as well. As their defenses grew for a day, then another, and for a third day, the city began to quiet down. The usual violence died out. The constant bickering and infighting also began to cease as rumors spread of the state of the city. They had all seen and heard the bombardment, and rumors of green-armored giants stalking the outskirts spread like pestilence through the streets. And then there were the massive prefabricated permacrete constructs that were rising all around it. Watchtowers with large, powerful searchlights which would illuminate the city at night. And the constant telltale signs of continued construction. This was probably the Sons of Medusa's plan, to inspire uncertainty and terror in the civilian populace, and also to ensure that if any of the organized factions that remained decided to try some sort of breakout action, that it would be stopped dead very swiftly, and would, if anything, merely add to the tension and fear in the rest of the city. After having allowed the populace to stew in their own terror for a sufficient period of time, on the fourth day the Sons of Medusa made their move. The full force of the three companies would advance in a mass-armored spearhead, rhinos, razorbacks, and land raiders, barreling out of the pre-dawn dust and fog, slamming into the outskirts of the old city, flattening hovels and old manufactorum frameworks alike beneath their iron treads. And after 3 weeks of wandering and worrying and questioning, many of the factions within the old city took up their weapons and counter-attacked the Sons of Medusa, reasoning that if the city fell, they could expect no mercy for their part in the rebellion. And after 3 days of horror and terror, it was better and quicker to simply get it over with, to throw themselves onto the Sun's guns and be obliterated in a hail of bolter fire and vindicator shells. Those who decided to prolong their sufferings by trying to hide, to go to ground in the ruined manufactorum complexes, were winkled out one group at a time by the Astartes and their superior war gear. Following in behind the Sons of Medusa's cutting edge was the Inquisition's own troops mounted in chimeras and APCs equipped with loudhailers. They were constantly broadcasting the message that all civilians should remain within the city's borders, should stay where they were, and surrender themselves when called upon to do so by Imperial personnel. Those who still had their wits about them would obey these instructions. As the city was squeezed in the power-armored gauntlets of the Sons of Medusa, it ruptured and spilled its juices everywhere. Vast columns of civilians, some in vehicles, some on foot, began streaming out of the city, away from the advance of the Sons of Medusa, imagining that there was some sort of safety if only they could get out of the city. But of course, it was surrounded by gun pits, by automated emplacements, who were also in turn constantly circled by land speeders and ravens, who would pick up on even the smallest group of civilians trying to make it through. The vehicles were burnt out, scattered, and shattered wrecks within minutes. The fleeing, huddled masses were blasted apart in the open by autocannons and heavy bolter fire. With those few who made it out of the engagement envelopes of the automated batteries being picked off by land speeders as they tried to flee for the imagined safety of the salt flats beyond. The only thing slowing down the Sons of Medusa's advance at this point was the sheer size of the old city. It was a vast, ancient complex, and they were advancing slowly and carefully, ensuring that each and every zone was secure before moving on to the next one. They were not in a hurry, and besides, there were still quite a few interesting items to be catalogued and perhaps carried away for later studies. It was only much later on, when they approached the heart of the old city, that they encountered any form of real organized resistance. The city warders had held up within the fortified barracks houses of their old precincts. These were designed to withstand large-scale riots, and were often complete with permacrete bunkers and automated gun turrets of their own, along with embattlements and fortified towers. These could be a minor problem, and so the Sons of Medusa simply just ignored them, choosing instead to go around and secure the other areas instead. The Industrial Guild's own houses were also vast and contained within them significant portions of rebels. These would be taken care of first. They did have some weaponry, but nothing that could really threaten a true son of the God Emperor. And so they waded in with fists, chainswords, and power weapons, by and large slinging their bolters so as to conserve ammunition for the fortified barracks houses, which were taken care of last. Ringed by land raiders, rhinos, razorbacks, vindicators, and strafed by thunderhawks, land speeders, and ravens, the fortifications were reduced bunker by bunker, tower by tower, and barracks by barracks, not giving the city warders any chance to resist effectively. The entire operation took just about 56 hours. And it only took that long because the Sons were being careful, really taking their time, reducing each and every tiny little area of resistance one by one with overwhelming firepower. No sense in wasting good space marines on such a piddly compliance after all. The heavy-handed measures taken by the Sons of Medusa also succeeded in a secondary objective, taking the fight completely out of any remaining rebel elements. When called upon to do so, hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of people simply walked out of the old city. Hundreds, if not thousands, guarded by single inquisitorial stormtroopers, as mile-long lines snaked back to the landing zones prepared by the Sons of Medusa, where the Inquisition had set up temporary interrogation centers, where each and every single civilian was going to have his personal involvement in the uprising evaluated and judged by inquisitorial acolytes. And yes, interrogating and judging millions of people is going to take years, if not indeed decades. But the Inquisition is a remarkably petulant, petty, and stubborn organization, particularly in these matters. And they had discovered an unexpected boon. Even the most dedicated Inquisitor and Acolyte would probably get a little bit tired after the 100,000th or so interrogation. But there was one individual who was very unlikely to tire of handing out justice in this matter. During the retaking of the water treatment facility, you see, they had come across a secret room, hidden away and not shown on any blueprints, within which they found a handful of acolytes still tending to the near fatally wounded body of Inquisitor Shard. And oh boy, you bet she held a grudge for this. Every last man, woman, and child on the planet would be paraded before the lacerated form of Inquisitor Shard to receive their due process. I imagine her judgment will be swift, uncompromising, a hint merciless, but fair, of course. because the Inquisition has defined itself as always being fair and just. In fact, they go so far as to say that they, quite unequivocally, have a monopoly on justice. An enviable position, no doubt. As for the sons of Medusa, they would hang around for a little while longer, overseeing the initial stages of the interrogation operations, and to ensure that the various small, scattered habitats across the planet would also follow the old city's example. Very few of them actually required any form of threatening or cajoling, as the word of the fate of the old city spread quickly, even over a planet as isolated as Galen 4. There was to be no more resistance from anyone in these parts. Soon, various Imperial Guard regiments, second and third line formations not really fit for combat detail, would be rerouted to the world to establish a proper Imperial garrison. And you bet your happy little ass they weren't going to settle for a single indentured regiment this time around. Oh no! The judgment process was going to go on for a while, and it was going to require considerable security protocols. Left Huron couldn't get enough manpower to safeguard the autonomous zone from the predations of pirates, but I guarantee you this: Galen 4 is not going to have a problem with raiders anytime soon. It is, after all, quite rare for anyone to try and break their way in to a prison complex, which was exactly what Galen 4 had been transformed into, as the populace received their, just punishment. Those who had taken an active part in the rebellion were all burned alive, but the majority of the population received a very lenient punishment of merely being indentured into penal legions, or placed in lifelong labor corps, where they would spend the rest of their natural life mining what mineral wealth remained out of Galen 4, leaving their planet even poorer than before. And this is why we don't piss off the Inquisition, kids. Because the lenient punishment is, from a certain point of view, harsher than the death penalty. Galen 4. A bit of a side story in the larger conflict, to be certain, but you know me, I'm hardly one to pass up an opportunity to demonstrate the just and correct course of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition. And speaking of inquisitorial machinations, another event occurred shortly thereafter. A single Space Marine strike cruiser appeared near the edges of the Golgothan wastes, and began sending out contact signals to nearby Imperial Navy patrols, who at first thought that this was an incursion by the secessionists, or possibly the arrival of another Astartes chapter of unknown allegiance. To further complicate matters as well, the ciphers attached to the messages were so incredibly outdated that at first they were expected to be forgeries. But after word was sent to Vengeance Station and inquisitorial personnel were able to scour the ancient archives, they were indeed found and ratified. They were old enough to not even be in the memory banks of many dreadnoughts serving in the campaign, but they were real. And to further make the matter a little bit more pressing, the strike cruiser further communicated to the initial Imperial contacts that, oh no, it wasn't here by itself. In fact, an entire chapter-sized fleet was coming in hot on its heels, a matter it neglected to mention until pressed on that particular point. So, 1,000 Adeptus Astartes of unknown origin were arriving in the Golgothan wastes without having been announced. And when they were asked as to why they were coming, they simply answered that they had been ordered to come by the God Emperor on Holy Terror. Right. Well, I mean, that's not an impossible reasoning. It's just a little bit along the lines of having a man knock on your door, and when you ask him why the hell he's there, he says, "Jesus sent me." Could be true, but it certainly does look a little bit suspicious, doesn't it? However, Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne personally took it upon himself to board a vessel and travel to meet this unknown chapter. An act of considerable bravery, especially considering the betrayal that had seen Verant Ortis of the Red Scorpions murdered. Or at least, so Frayne was eager to have it perceived. When he arrived, he was met by a full chapter-strength fleet of the Carcharodonts Astra. Oh, space sharks in common. Though, to be honest, space sharks. There is just too much darn B-movie in that name, so Carcharodonts it is. This only went some way, however, to quiet the suspicion of the other Loyalists. Garab Cullen in particular was very inquisitive as to how the Inquisitor had managed to draw a chapter that seemingly no one had heard of, and which had virtually no records logged about it, from the outer depths of the void. I'm sure Cullen was also worried about the apparent savagery of yet further reinforcements. The Inquisition's chapters had proven to be not to the Red Scorpion's liking or standards, and considering the Fire Angels who had accompanied the Legate Inquisitor to the meetings with the Carcharodons had described them as aberrant barbarians, that trend hardly seemed to be turning anytime soon. There was also a question about where their loyalties might lie, and if they would be simply another chapter like the Minotaurs, who would seemingly only receive instructions from one particular diminutive source with a capital I around his neck. And of course, the individual in question saw no particular problems with these new allies. In fact, after a standoff with the Carcharodon's flagship, the Nicor, Legate Inquisitor Frayne warmly accepted them into the war, and promised them that much good blood would absolutely be spilled in the name of the God Emperor in the execution of the remainder of this conflict. And the Carcharodons would absolutely be granted a leading role. In fact, he had marching orders for them immediately to head towards the Endymion cluster and the final destruction of the Mantis Warriors chapter. Something the Legate Inquisitor pointed out none too subtly, whilst being escorted by them nonetheless, that the Fire Angels had themselves failed to prosecute the Mantis Warriors. Oh, there is blood in the void, my friends, and so in the next episode, we're finally going to be seeing the Carcharodonts Astra in full action. Till then, I've been Arch, thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.